All right, here we go. Today we are talking about the Rocky Mountain Altitude. The Altitude is a 160 millimeter rear travel, 170 millimeter front travel enduro bike. This bike uses the same frame as the Rocky Mountain Instinct that I just rode and reviewed. It does have a different shock length and fork, so it has 20 millimeters more travel front and back. In turn, it also has slacker geometry. Both head tube and seat tube angle get slacker. This has the same Ride 9 system that the Instinct has, and it also has the same chainstay flip chip to adjust the chainstay length. It's a little bit funny that this is the same frame, so basically the same bike as the Instinct, but it is completely different. So let's jump into the ride impressions here. On the uphill, the bike isn't a showstopper. It's not slow, it's not terrible, but it's not a showstopper. This bike's fast enough and it will get you to the top of the hill, but it definitely doesn't care a ton about that. It isn't nearly as quick and snappy as something like the Ibis Ritmo, but it's still quite a bit better than something like the Norco Range. So it kind of falls where it should for the category. The suspension feels active just like the Instinct. It gives you a lot of traction, but that does lead to a little bit of pedal bob. I didn't have a problem with it. I wasn't too upset about it. I'm the kind of guy who would probably prefer the extra traction over a little bit more efficiency. Just when things get steep and loose or rocky, rooty, a little bit of extra traction I think goes further than more efficiency, but you know, to each their own. One thing I noticed about the bike is this seat tube angle is a little bit slacker, and it was probably on the slacker side of things, at least for my preference. And in turn, it made the reach out to the handlebars feel long. The seat tube wasn't slack enough that I was wheeling up all the hills or that the front end became really light and wandery. It wasn't bad, but it was a little bit slacker than maybe I'd prefer. So overall climbing performance, like I said earlier, fairly average for the category, give it a B+. Now let's get into the downhill, and that's where this bike really starts to shine. It is no surprise that I love the Transition Sentinel, and this bike gives that one a run for its money in my book. So from the get-go, before I even left the garage, this bike felt squishy. When I first sat on it, I thought I was gonna have to put 30, 40 PSI in the shock. It felt like I didn't have enough air. And then I checked my sag, and I was actually under 30%. So this bike just feels squishy. And out on the trail, it honestly reminded me of like a bit bigger, earlier Santa Cruz Hightower. It had that same squishy plush feel. It has a very grounded, quiet ride quality to it. It doesn't get knocked around too much. It doesn't bounce a ton in the bumps and the chatter. It stays on the ground very, very well. That's great for giving you a ton of traction and a ton of control over your bike. Physically, it's a very quiet bike. Like, you don't hear a ton, and it makes this really cool pitter-patter sound like this. So it is not as poppy as the Instinct. It has a lot more of a ground-hugging, plush feel. It feels a lot like that Santa Cruz Hightower where it wants to stay on the ground. I wouldn't call it dead. You can still get it off the ground, especially in that shorter chainstay mode. It does get off the ground just a little bit easier, but I wouldn't call it poppy by any means. It did okay at the jump park where you had a big lip to get you airborne. But if you're just trying to bunny hop, it's a little tougher to get this bike off the ground. And that was surprising, especially because the Instinct was incredibly easy to get off the ground. But the thing that just stood out to me the most about this suspension platform was how plush and how smooth it was. With how soft it felt initially, I just, in my head, was thinking I was just gonna be slamming through the travel, finding bottom constantly, and that wasn't the case. One unique thing about this bike is it is long travel and it's made to go fast downhill, but the geometry is actually fairly moderate. So the overall wheelbase on this is 1285 millimeters. So just for a point of reference, and I'll do this a lot throughout this video, I will compare this to the Transition Sentinel because I think they're fairly similar. The Sentinel has a wheelbase of 1292 millimeters, and to compare it to a couple of the other enduro bikes, the Transition Spire has a 1324 millimeter wheelbase, and the Norco Range has a 1329 millimeter wheelbase. So out of all those bikes, it's actually the shortest. And we'll get into how that affects the handling, but it actually was pretty nice. It was a little refreshing. And the head tube on this bike is a little bit steeper than other bikes, especially in the category. So it is adjustable. It goes from 64.4 degrees to 65.5 degrees. For a point of reference, the Sentinel is 63.6 degrees. The Spire is 62.5 degrees, and the Norco Range is 63 even. So it's the steepest of that whole bunch too. And again, it was kind of refreshing. The more moderate geometry keeps the bike very lively and very quick in the corners. Still not as quick as that Instinct, but for the category, I think it is the best in the corners. It doesn't feel like this big, burly, long bike like the Norco Range. It couldn't feel more different from that bike in the corners. Even in the long chainstay mode, which is actually where I did most of my testing, the bike got around a corner just fine. I never felt like the bike was too long or too unmanageable. And I think part of that is also the head tube angle. It's a little bit more responsive. It's a little bit steeper. I never felt like it was too steep. I did ride a couple pretty steep and pretty bumpy trails, and I never felt like the head tube angle was out to get me. I didn't feel squirrely or sketchy. I actually set my fastest time ever on kind of a steep and rough trail on this bike, and I've ridden it on others like the Range. So to sum up the downhill, I think this is just a very well-rounded enduro bike. So I think this one blurs the lines between enduro and all mountain. I would say it's in the enduro category. It's capable enough, it has enough travel to let you race enduro, but I think it's very versatile like an all mountain bike. So quick comparisons to other bikes that I have ridden recently compared to the Rocky Mountain Instinct. This bike is way more plush, way more grounded, way more controlled. It gets after it in a completely different way on the downhill. Compared to the Transition Sentinel, which I think is probably the most similar bike, this bike does feel a bit more enduro. It's got more travel front and back. Even though the geometry is not quite as aggressive as the Sentinel, I think this bike is every bit as capable, if not more capable on the downhill. I think the Sentinel goes uphill just a little bit better, but probably not a huge difference there. And I think the Altitude is every bit as versatile as that Sentinel is. And now comparing it to the Norco Range, which is on the burly side of the enduro spectrum, this bike is way less of a tank. It almost doesn't even feel like it's in the same category of bikes, and maybe it's because that Range is just basically a downhill bike. This one feels way quicker in the corners, way more nimble and maneuverable. It's easier to get off the ground, and I think it's a much more versatile bike. Granted, that Range in the nasty kind of double black diamond style terrain is a little bit faster, but I think when you're on kind of single black diamond terrain or easier double blacks, I think the Altitude is every bit as fast, if not faster. So who is this bike for? I think it's for the person who only wants or can only have one bike and they never want to be outgunned. You want to be able to ride every trail and be confident on every trail, but you also go ride some easier stuff sometimes and you don't want to be bored or you don't want to be overbiked. I think this bike's a pretty good compromise between those two things. You're not going to get outgunned often, if ever, and it's still pretty okay on the mellower chill trails. And I think if you're someone who enjoys a plush bike and that's the number one priority is you want soft, smooth, comfortable, I don't think you can beat this one. In fact, I think it feels more plush than my Norco Range that has a coil on it and more travel in the back. I think it's also a great bike for someone who likes adjustability. You know, you've got Ride 9, you've got the adjustable chainstay, and if you want, you can swap the upper shock mount and the shock length, and you can make this thing an Instinct. So it is a super adjustable, super versatile bike. So one line bike review on the Rocky Mountain Altitude. It is the least one-trick pony of all the enduro bikes. Thanks for sticking around. See you next time.